Um, the bodies of the mostly black victims of the Republican white nationalists inspired mass shooting in Buffalo weren't even cold on Saturday before the folks at faux identified who they believe were the real victims here. White conservatives, as we predicted they would on Sunday. The whining from the right-wing media has since reached ear-piercing levels of shrill in response to mainstream media correctly pointing out that Republicans and their media had been hyping the Great Replacement conspiracy theory that the shooter Peyton Gendron had used to justify the killing of 10 people. But this isn't just an attempt to evade accountability. Faux, which is not even a real news channel, the pundits there are now exploiting the Buffalo shooting to draw their viewers further into white nationalism. Network personalities are romanticizing the hateful ideology that allegedly inspired a massacre as a dangerous truth that the elite are trying to suppress. This shooting really illustrates how Faux has created a victim narrative for its viewers, but that is so potent that no event is so horrible or violent, including a deadly insurrection in the Capitol or the mass murder of innocent people, that can't be weaponized by the propaganda machine to further radicalize Republican voters. Not surprising, at the front of the remorseless pack was Fucker Carlson, Foe's top idiot, was already being called out as the biggest mainstreamer of the Great Replacement conspiracy theory, which is a ridiculous notion drawn from neo-Nazis and other white supremacists that a cabal of Democrats is masterminding demographic change in order to marginalize white Christians. His response on Monday was a masterful bit of every propaganda that we could imagine, using Saturday's horror show to convince his viewers, who are already sympathetic to the terrorist views, to double down on racist conspiracy theories. Within minutes of Saturday's shooting, before all bodies of those 10 murdered Americans had been identified by their loved ones, the professional Democrats had begun a coordinated campaign to blame those murders on the political opponents. Carlson, Fucker really knows how to spin a conspiracy theory. In reality, the Great Replacement theory is widely denounced because it's a racist lie. But he spins this universal condemnation as evidence that Democrats must have coordinated the criticism. This in turn fits in with the larger narrative that Fucker has been pushing for many years now, which is that Democrats disparage racist ideas not because they're wrong, but because they're right. And Fucker wants his audience to believe that these ideas are so true that they're dangerous to the elites and that they're censoring the ideas to keep the probable truth from getting out. Excuse me. This is generally how the cancel culture narrative works for the right. Ideologies like white nationalism, much less conspiracy theories like Great Replacement, they fall apart if you think about them too carefully. So rather than defend these ideas on any merit, propagandists portray the ideas as dangerous truths that a shadowy cabal tries to suppress. The implication is that the best way to rebel against the mythical Democrat oppressor is to embrace these racist ideas. The faux pitch boiled down: be a white nationalist because it triggers the Democrats. Carlson Fucker wasn't the only host using a conservatard victimization narrative to reinscribe the Great Replacement narrative for faux viewers. The racist cunt Laura Ingraham ranted about how the media tried to censor opposing views, and they tried to criminalize their political opposition after January 6th, but none of the anti-free speech tactics ever worked. Again, criticism is equated with censorship. Again, the faux host doesn't the racist faux host doesn't really try to defend these rancid political views. Again, the pivot is to pitch that her audience adopts insurrectionism, COVID-19 denialism, and white nationalism in order to rebel for free speech. On his pathetic faux show, Jesse Waters was banging the same drum, arguing that condemnations of racism are merely attempted to manipulate people with guilt, and there are very powerful forces in this country that want you to be distracted. He insisted characterizing any effort to eradicate the racism that fueled these murders as an effort to change the subject from gas prices and inflation. The implication is not subtle. If Democrats want to shame the racism out of you, you must cling to it harder and, of course, deny all along that it's racism and instead argue that it's just truth in you. The Daily Wire is for that portion of the right-wing audience that is too dim to understand what faux is arguing through is arguing through implication, and it needs to be spelled out more directly for them. The host, Matt Walsh, was only too happy to do this, whining about how the mainstream media correctly identifying Great Replacement as a conspiracy theory. Instead, he insisted it's just a fact that they want to replace especially white male voters with voters who they think are going to be beholden to them. Donald Trump himself is number one for the more subtle propagandistic techniques of Fucker or the racist cunt Ingram. He was also blunt on faux host Sean Hannity's radio show, claiming immigration is like a military invasion. As Nicholas Confessor had reported in the recent and surprisingly gloves off New York Times deep and dive into Fucker Carlson, Faux long ago stopped seeing condemnation from mainstream media and Democrats as a negative thing, and now instead it sees it as a selling point. Fucker and his team learned to work the calls for boycotts and cancellation into the programming playbook. Fucker would grab third rails on race or immigration, and then he would harvest the inevitable backlash, returning the next evening to roast his critics for trying to suppress an obvious truth. The strategy boasted the audience's loyalty to Faux. He continued because it allows Fucker, again, to spin a tale where he and his sycophants are in the trenches together, fighting against cancel culture, but this tactic doesn't just increase viewer loyalty to Faux, it also increases their willingness to adopt some of the ugliest ideas the network is peddling, including the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. The Great Replacement used to be a fringe idea that even racist Republicans would dismiss as loony a few years ago, but as we noted Sunday, polling shows half of Republican voters now buying into the Great Replacement paranoia. That's after these ideas fueled multiple mass shootings, the 2017 riot in Charlottesville, and the January 6th Klan insurrection, and all of that violence, it seems, only served to make white nationalism more popular on the right. In light of this, one has to assume that far from trying to avoid Democratic outrage in the aftermath of the shooting, Fucker and company welcome it. Every mass shooting on the right-wing side creates an opportunity for the right-wing media to play the victim, further endearing themselves to their audience and allowing them to portray racist ideas as dangerous truths. That's why they don't seem to care at all that their propaganda is fueling any violence. On the contrary, the violence is used to fuel a machine of right-wing self-pity and agreement, and further driving the Republican voters towards fascism. And not that any of this should discourage journalists. The Democratic politicians or progressives in general from calling out the violent rhetoric or the racism. Yes, such condemnations are being weaponized by Faux in order to grow conservative support for radical ideas, but it also helps prevent such ideas from spreading to the larger population. Republicans need some amount of moderate support to succeed, which they can only get by hoodwinking moderates into thinking that they're not as bad as they actually are, and calling out the GOP radicalism is absolutely necessary. Trump, Carlson, and company are going to keep pushing their base towards the far right until they start facing real consequences in the ballot box for doing so, and this fucking situation is just going to get fucking worse. So if you like the video, you can give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, RBW King. You can also hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when a new video comes out. And if you want to support my work even further, you can donate to my Patreon link, which you can find in the About section of YouTube. And for just as little as a few bucks a month, you can help further support the channel. And thanks for listening.